Well, we are living in troubled times. And it's not as if there are ever any perfect ones, of course, but things right now do seem particularly out of sorts. And when it gets like this, it's natural for us to seek comfort and answers. And that means knowing where to look for them, even if it isn't obvious. We have to remember that just because we don't see the Lord, don't see Him at work, that does not mean He is not watching over us, that He does not see us. But also, we better know that He is watching what we are doing. That's the lesson of Psalm 10, which is where we're going to be today as we continue with the songs of lament. And so I hope that everybody, especially if you've been here before, that you brought a Bible with you, because I always recommend that you just have your own. It's a good opportunity to familiarize yourself with it more so that you're hopefully using it on a daily basis too. But then also just because as I read a slide, we'll move past it eventually, and if you want to see what it had said previously, you'll need a Bible in front of you to be able to do that. Now, if you don't have one, that's all right, because we do have some out on the table in the entryway if you wanted to get one of those to be able to turn here. But we're going to Psalm chapter 10, and we're going to start with verse 1. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the Lord. Now, the psalmist's opening questions here are a frequent feature of the lament psalms. The most famous example of that, we looked at this in a previous series on the Psalms actually, but it's Psalm 22. That's the one that opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words very famously repeated by Jesus on the cross. Now, that is a complaint against God. And the thing about such complaints against God is that they do suffer a fatal flaw. They are untrue. They are based on our experience, not on reality. That was part of the reason, at least in my opinion, why Jesus spoke those words on the cross, because that psalm ends on a very high note. And it was his way of saying that even as he was in the midst of suffering that way, he was still looking forward to the answer that the Father would provide. But again, when we are going through moments like these, we're not really always seeing the reality. We're just going by our experience. And experience does matter. Feelings don't always care about the facts. There are times when we can't help but feel that the Lord is not there for us. Like I'm saying, we're wrong if we feel that way, but we do. We have to come to terms with that emotional impact. And in this case, the psalmist's feeling was that the Lord was absent. If he were there, he could help. But since he isn't, things are going wrong. Or perhaps it could actually be even more of an accusation than that, because you could reverse the order. That the psalmist is maybe implying the Lord knew there was something coming that he wasn't actually strong enough to do anything about, and so he ran away and hid. And there is actually, that's a way of stating something that modern critics of religion will say, too. You've probably maybe heard this phrase before. If God is all good, then he is not all-powerful. Or if God is all-powerful, then he is not all good. And the reason why they say that is because of the existence of evil in this world. They take that as proof, and the fact that God is not doing anything about it as either evidence that he cannot or that he doesn't care enough to. That's the conclusion that they draw. Ultimately, in the service of finally saying that he doesn't exist at all. That if there were a God, there just wouldn't be any evil, and because there's evil, there is no God. So it's interesting to find this supposedly modern sentiment expressed in ancient scripture by a faithful person. This is just something very human to struggle with, because as the Bible also says, there's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Now, as for what has the psalmist feeling this way, it's not personal. Not like it was last week with what we saw, with what David was going through. This author doesn't refer to himself at all. He doesn't talk about anyone who's harming him, at least not directly. He's really more interested in a general problem, in a societal problem. He's complaining about the rampancy of crime. And that's something that we can certainly relate with. Now, when I was writing this, when I was researching and preparing it, we didn't have some breaking news from this week. And so I wanted to initially, and I still will, I might as well go ahead and talk about how statistics can be made to lie. You can make them say pretty much whatever you want to. And that was something that was going on with crime statistics, is that law enforcement agencies were not reporting their arrests, or they were refusing to make arrests, or prosecutors were refusing to bring cases to trial, or local governments and states were reclassifying felonies as misdemeanors. Those were all ways that crime statistics were being driven down, and yet even so, numbers were released this week, updated numbers by the FBI, showing, and they were from 2022. We still don't even know what 2023s and 24s are going to be like, but from 2022, they revised their numbers because of some reports that finally came through to them and showed that what was supposedly a decrease in crime was actually a massive increase in crime. So we're not just feeling that's the case, now we actually have the proof of it too. We are, in our society, witnessing a rising trend of lawlessness. But there are some people who have been saying, no, that's not true. There's not more of it. At the same time, and now more loudly, they've been saying, it's a good thing that it's happening. So they go from saying that it wasn't to, well, it's right that it is. And they would say that this psalm doesn't apply to the modern situation because this psalm talks about the poor and about what the poor need. And all these crimes, they say, are really just the poor taking from the greedy. That's what makes it a good thing. That it's the rich who cause injustice. We ought to know better than that. Now, no question, some wealthy people do abuse the system. But when the Bible speaks of the poor, it is not just referring to those who are materially lacking. It's not talking about people without money. That's not the only thing that it means. What it means is those who are put upon, who are not receiving justice. Now, it's more likely for somebody who is, again, economically poor to be in that situation because they have no way to buy justice for themselves or to help themselves out of a difficult situation. So, yes, that's generally going to be the case, but it's not only the case. There are people who have a lot who can face injustices, and they are poor in those moments. And also, on the other hand, greed is not just for the rich. Anyone can try to satisfy their own covetousness, their own desire for what they do not have a right to. And it doesn't matter how much else they have, anyone can act that way. So people who steal from retailers or squat in homes, they don't have a right to do that. Business and property owners have a right to operate. And even more importantly, this is really the point, consumers who are following the rules and are paying what they are asked to pay, they have a right to not have the costs of crime passed down to them, which is what happens to us when these things are on the rise. So the people who are proud of themselves or proud of others for taking advantage, they ought to be ashamed, but they're not. They see no reason to be, which the psalmist, about 3,000 years ago, he understood as well and speaks of next in what we see at verse 4. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God's in none of his thoughts. His ways are always prospering. Your judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he sneers at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression, and under his tongue is trouble and iniquity. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In the secret places he murders the innocent. His eyes are secretly fixed on the helpless. He lies in wait secretly, as a lion in his den. He lies in wait to catch the poor. He catches the poor when he draws him into his net. So he crouches, he lies low, that the helpless may fall by his strength. He has said in his heart, God is forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see. Now, something interesting happens in these verses, because they show how the same evidence can be interpreted differently as a matter of perspective. The opening of this psalm, think back to the psalmist's opening questions, they were about God being absent, right? Because when good people suffer, it feels like we can't find him. It's like he's hiding. And for good people, that's a source of anxiety. But what I mean is, the criminals actually come to the same conclusion. Evil people think the same thing. When they cause good people to suffer, they also assume it means that God has gone away, but for them, rather than anxiety, it's a source of boldness. They draw something different from it, which starts with renouncing God. That was actually mentioned in verse 3. They make a decision to not bother with trying to be faithful to God. They figure if they're not attached to his service, if they basically say, well, I want nothing to do with him, then that excuses them from him, makes it so that they're not accountable. And that seems to work. Pays off to take what you want and break the rules, to take advantage of all the dupes and suckers who try to do the right thing rather than taking shortcuts. And the more that works for the criminals, the more they do it. The lack of immediate consequences leads them to believe there are no consequences for anything, and so they ramp up the greater crimes, even to the taking of innocent life, if it gets in the way of their happiness. And we see that most horrifically in the taking of the most innocent life, millions of them, before they can even be born. Abortion is the ultimate example of this, because it's precisely what it's for. 99% of abortions in this country are elective. They are only because somebody doesn't want the inconvenience of a child. And so this is precisely what is happening, precisely what is being spoken to. And it and all of these other things that we deal with are the result of a willful blindness. It's people saying, since God hasn't stopped me, he never will, or he can't, or he doesn't know, or he isn't real, whatever they have to tell themselves. It's all an excuse to keep pursuing their own desires and hurt whoever they have to along the way. Because these people feel that it's good that the Lord is not watching, just as we feel that it's bad. But again, we're both wrong to think that he's not watching. And that is what the psalmist realized. And that's how he closes. So we go to verse 12. Arise, O Lord. O God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the humble. Why do the wicked renounce God? He has said in his heart, you will not require an account, but you have seen, for you observe trouble and grief to repay it by your hand. The helpless commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations have perished out of his land. Lord, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will prepare their heart. You will cause your ear to hear, to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may oppress no more. This is the truth that everyone on both sides of this issue has missed. It's that long-suffering is not ignorance. God's patience is not God ignoring what is going on. And when he says not now, that's not the same as him saying never. We are so short-sighted that we get deceived into thinking that God is the one with the bad eyes. And take it back to that original idea that we were going over, that idea about God. God isn't doing anything about evil, they say, so either he's not strong enough to or he doesn't care enough to. The very simple answer is that God's not doing what you want about it yet. That's what it boils down to. Because we can't know all of what he's planning, or why he allows what he does, or what he has in store. We don't know the future. He's the one with it in his hands. And so when we take this attitude that God's not doing anything about evil, we're really just trying to force our perspective on him, either to complain about it or to try to get away with things. But the wicked are wrong to think that they will get away with anything. And the righteous would be wrong to give up on his help. Because after all, there is enough evidence to go on already. The psalmist mentioned God driving the nations out of his land. He's referring to the Canaanites, being the Amorites, being forced out of the promised land when the Israelites arrived. But you can expand that, because God has cast down many nations and empires of evil. There has always been a time when they are brought to an account and when their conquests turn to them being conquered. So good does prevail, even now, even in this current world. Do the evil really think that they will survive him with all the other examples to look at? And can we really think that he will let his people down? We look back and see that he has stopped oppressors in their tracks before. He'll do so again. Breaking their arms is the image that the psalmist uses here. It's very similar to the one that we saw last week in Psalm 3 about breaking their teeth. And so whether it's the criminal or the animal, the idea behind both of these is not just harming the evildoer. It's not merely punishment. It's about destroying their power to cause harm. They won't be able to punch. They won't be able to bite anymore. And so we can certainly be troubled over the time that it takes to get to that result as we see the spread of sin and crime and wonder where God is in all of it. But we should always come back to the point of knowing he isn't blind. So we should ask for him to show himself. We should pray that the King of Heaven would put mere earthlings in their place, never ever forgetting exactly how he showed he would most clearly of all, which was by becoming a man of the earth. When Jesus suffered more injustice and oppression than anyone else ever has or is capable of, and completely innocently, he did it to be punished in the place of the guilty, because we've all committed crimes against God. But he suffered as though he was the one who caused it all. And when he rose from the grave, he showed that no power is greater than his. Not death's, not anything else. So when the time comes in the Father's purposes, everyone will see him. Because he's not hiding, he's waiting. And there will be nowhere to hide from him when he delivers what's due. Death to those who demand it, because they want nothing to do with him as the source of life, but life to all those who request it in him. So you do have to request it. If you aren't saved, you need to open your eyes to understand that God isn't hiding from you. The truth is that you haven't been looking for him. And that's because you'd rather he wasn't watching. Understand, pretending doesn't make it so. You have a debt of sin to him. Your crimes have been against him in everything that you've taken that didn't belong to you, every lie that you have told, every insult that you have thrown, every harm that you have done to those around you. It was all for short-term benefit with no thought to long-term cost. And you won't get away with it. But I'm not saying that in order to make you feel uniquely guilty. as though you're just a horrible person and we're here to say how much better we are than you. No. It describes everyone. You, me, all the other people here, anywhere else that you can find them. We cannot make up for who we are and what we've done. It's a terrifying realization, but we have to come to it in order to discover the glorious solution. It's that Jesus did make up for who we are and what we've done. He took what you deserved on the cross and rose to prove that life is available if you trust in Him. So can you finally do that today? Will you open your eyes? You can do that from wherever you are, sitting here, sitting at home. If you do want to do that with us as witness to it, if you want to be able to share in that moment with us, then I'll be standing off to the side here. There's a song that's going to play as soon as this message is over. And you can come up and we can talk about it. And I'm more than happy to do that with anyone who wants to so that we can be part of the celebration for that. Now, as for the Lord's people, it obviously isn't always easy for us. And if you feel like God is far away and not watching closely, you aren't alone. The authors of the Bible felt that way from time to time. But they had enough faith to not let their feelings get the best of them. Do what they did. Hang on in troubled times. Remember that waiting for deliverance is not the same as never being delivered. And keep crying out to God, knowing that He will show Himself. Christ made that abundantly clear. Take courage from it, and then let other people know, so that they will look for Him